Did Jews before the time of Jesus expect the Messiah to be divine? Because many people today claim that the idea of divine Messiah was invented later by Christians. Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his Kedoshim, holy ones, to execute judgment upon all. Now, if you're a Christian, that might sound familiar. In fact, you might think those words came from the New Testament letter of Jude, because Jude actually quotes this passage. But Jude wasn't inventing the line, he was referencing something older. Those words came from the Second Temple period Jewish book called First Enoch. Written before the time of Jesus, fragments of this book were even discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is always a fun moment for historians, because it means this text was circulated before Christianity even existed. In other words, before the Christian Gospels were written. Some Jews, particularly the Essenes, but others as well, were already describing the Lord coming in judgment with countless holy ones. And that raises a rather interesting question, because if Jewish writers were already saying things like this before Christianity even existed, then the story might be a little more complicated than people think. And that's where things start to get interesting. What were Jews actually expecting the Messiah to be? Because today you'll often hear the claim that the idea of a divine Messiah, as I said, was invented later by Christians. But if we look carefully at Second Temple Judaism, and if we look carefully at the Hebrew scriptures, those writings were interpreting, the picture starts to become more interesting, much more interesting. So in this video, we're going to examine the evidence. And as is the custom of this channel, we're not going to take guesses. We're not going to let our theology dictate what the text should say. We're not going to correct God. We're going to look at the Hebrew scriptures, and we're going to look at the Jewish writings before the time of Jesus, before the time Jesus appears on the scene. And we're going to ask one simple question. Was the Messiah supposed to be divine? The question, so what exactly were Jews expecting the Messiah to be? Today you'll often hear the claim that Jesus' followers slowly exaggerated who he was, and eventually turned a human teacher into a divine figure. Now, in the ancient world, the idea of divine rulers wasn't unusual. Egyptian pharaohs were treated as gods. Greek and Roman rulers were sometimes honored as divine figures. By the time of the Roman Empire, emperors like Augustus were even worshipped in temples across the empire. But Israel's scriptures were very different. Israel's God was not just a God, he was the God. The God of Israel insisted that he alone was God, which means if the Hebrew scriptures start describing a figure who shares in God's authority, that raises a very interesting question. And by the time Jesus appears on the scene, Judaism is not a single uniform voice. Different groups are reading the same scriptures and drawing very different conclusions about what God is about to do. Some expected a royal Messiah from the line of David. Some even expected more than one Messiah. And some interpretations of passages like Daniel led to debates about whether more than one figure could share in God's authority. But if the claim is true that Christians invented the idea of a divine Messiah, then we should expect something very simple. When we look at the Jewish writings from before the time of Jesus, and when we look at the Hebrew scriptures, those writings were, when we look at those Hebrew scriptures were interpreting, we should find no expectation of Messiah sharing in God's authority, just a human figure, a political deliverer, a descendant of David who restores Israel. But when we start examining the text carefully, that's not quite what we find, because some passages in the Hebrew scriptures create a very interesting puzzle, a puzzle that Jewish interpreters were already wrestling with long before Christianity began. And the first place that this puzzle appears is in a vision recorded in the book of Daniel. The vision in Daniel. The first place this puzzle really begins to appear is in a vision recorded in Daniel. In chapter 7, Daniel describes what looks very much like a courtroom scene in heaven. Thrones are set in place. The Ancient of Days takes his seat. In other words, Daniel is watching a heavenly courtroom scene. Then Daniel says something remarkable. I saw in the night visions, and behold, With the clouds of heaven, they came one like a son of man. This figure approaches the Ancient of Days, and then Daniel says something very striking. To him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. Now, this is where a little historical context helps. In the ancient world, one of the most famous titles for the Canaanite storm god Baal was the rider of the clouds. Across ancient myths, riding the clouds was always something associated with divine beings. If anyone remembers the old TV series Monkey Magic, Monkey used to whistle for a cloud and ride around on it. The memories. Baal was believed to ride on the clouds and bring the storms and rain, and Israel lived right in the middle of that cultural world, so there was a real battle of ideas taking place. The prophets of Israel repeatedly took the same imagery and applied it to Yahweh instead. In Psalms 104, God is described as the one who makes the clouds, and he makes the clouds his chariot. And in Isaiah 19, the Lord is said to be riding on a swift cloud as he comes in judgment. In other words, the message of the Hebrew scriptures is very clear. The God of Israel is not just another regional deity. He is the one who rules all nations. While the gods of the surrounding cultures were believed to judge only their own peoples, Israel's God sends his prophets to pronounce judgment on every nation, which makes Daniel's vision even more interesting, because suddenly Daniel sees a figure who looks human coming on the clouds of heaven. That detail will become very important later. And Daniel tells us that this figure receives dominion, glory, and a kingdom, authority over all peoples, nations, and languages, an everlasting dominion that will never pass away. So the text presents us with a puzzle, and by this point, the puzzle is starting to look a little unusual. A figure who looks human but receives authority and imagery that the Hebrew scriptures state that it belongs to God himself, which raises a very simple question. Who exactly is this figure? Quiz time, a quick history lesson. In the 4th century, a teacher named Arius argued that Jesus was not truly divine, but a created being, something like the highest creature God ever made. His teaching became so controversial that it eventually led to the Council of Nicaea. Interestingly, that council was sometimes even called the Council of Martyrs. Here's the question. Which modern group still teaches something very close to Arius' view? A. Jehovah's Witnesses, B. Mormons, or C. Both? I'll give you the answer in a moment. David's Lord. Daniel's vision raises an interesting question. The human figure appears in heaven, coming on the clouds, and receives authority over all nations. But Daniel isn't the only place in the Hebrew scriptures where something like this appears. There's another passage that the Jewish interpreters have been wrestling with for centuries. Oh, and the answer to the quiz? Both. Both groups teach versions of a view very similar to Arius' idea that Jesus is not eternally God. Historically, that view is called Arianism. It comes from a psalm written by King David. In Psalm 110, David writes, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." Now, on the surface, that might not sound unusual, but if you slow down and read it carefully, something very interesting appears. David is Israel's king, and yet here, David refers to someone as my Lord, which is a bit like a king writing about someone greater than himself. Well, it is a king writing about someone greater than himself. Imagine a president writing in his diary, "My president." Yeah, that would raise some questions. You would immediately ask, who on earth is he talking about? Which means the figure David is speaking about someone who must be greater than David himself. And this figure is invited to sit at God's right hand. In the ancient world, sitting at the right hand of a king meant sharing in the king's authority. It was a position of rulership. Now, occasionally people try to resolve this passage by focusing on the word until. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool, as though this means the authority described here is temporary, or that somehow the two figures must actually be the same person. But that's not how the language works. The word until simply marks a period of time leading up to the defeat of their enemies. It doesn't mean that the person sitting at the king's right hand suddenly becomes the king. In fact, the entire image assumes two figures are present. The Lord speaking and David's Lord being invited to share in his rule. So once again, the Hebrew scriptures present us with a puzzle. A figure greater than David seated beside God, sharing in God's authority, which raises the same question again. Who exactly is David talking about? Called mighty God. By this point, we've already seen two passages in the Hebrew scriptures that raise some interesting questions. In Daniel, we saw a human figure coming in the clouds of heaven and receiving authority over nations, over all nations. In Psalms 110, David speaks of a figure greater than himself who is invited to sit at God's right hand and share in his rule. But there is another passage that takes the puzzle even further. It comes from the prophet Isaiah. In chapter 9, Isaiah announces the birth of a future ruler. For to us a king is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders. So far that sounds like the promise of a royal descendant of David. But then Isaiah continues, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, El Gibor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Now that is a very unusual title because the phrase El Gibor, Mighty God, is not just poetic language. Earlier in the same book, Isaiah uses that exact phrase to describe the God of Israel himself. In Isaiah 10:21, the prophet says, a remnant will return to El Gibor, the mighty God. In other words, Isaiah already uses this title for Yahweh, which means in Isaiah's own vocabulary, El Gibor is not the title of an angel or a lesser deity or a lesser divine being. Isaiah already told us what El Gibor means. It's not ambiguous. It means the God of Israel. And this is important to remember. Israel's faith is not vague about God. The Hebrew scriptures insist repeatedly that there is only one God. The God of Israel alone created the heavens and the earth. The God of Israel alone rules the nations. So when a promised child from David's line is described using a title applied to God himself, the text presents us with another puzzle. A human ruler bearing a title used for the God of Israel. And by the time the Second Temple period, Jewish readers were already wrestling with passages like this, which means that the question we're asking in this video isn't something Christians invented centuries later. The question was already there in the text. What exactly did Isaiah mean? How Jews wrestled with these texts. By the time we reached the period just before the New Testament, these passages were already being discussed and interpreted by Jewish writers. In other words, the puzzle we've been looking at in the Hebrew scriptures was not something Christians invented centuries later. Jewish writers were already trying to understand it. One example of this appears in the ancient text called 1st Enoch. Now, if you've never heard of 1st Enoch before, don't worry, most people haven't. But it shows us how Jewish readers were already thinking about these passages. This book was written during the Second Temple period. By the time of Jesus, fragments of it were even discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In this text, we find a figure called the Son of Man, if you recognize that. A heavenly ruler associated with glory, dominion, and the judgment of all the nations. In other words, Jewish writers were already wrestling with the same ideas we've seen in Daniel, but there was another expectation as well. Near the end of the Hebrew scriptures, the prophet Malachi writes, "The Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple." That line carried enormous weight because after the Babylon exile, the temple had been rebuilt, but many Jews believed the glory of God, the Shekinah presence that filled the first temple, had never returned in the same way. So passages like this created an expectation that God himself would one day return to his temple. And when you put all these pieces together, Daniel, son of man, David's Lord at God's right hand, the child called El Gibor, the promise that the Lord will come to his temple, you can begin to see why Jewish readers were wrestling with these texts. The pieces were already on the table. which makes what happens next even more interesting. The claim that calls the charge of blasphemy. By the time we reach the New Testament period, all of these ideas were already part of the conversation. The Son of Man from Daniel's vision, David's Lord seated at God's right hand, the child called Gibor in Isaiah, and the expectation that the Lord himself will come to his temple. These passages had been discussed and debated for centuries by this point. And then something remarkable happens. Someone finally says it out loud. And the room immediately understands what he meant. In the Gospel account, Jesus stands before the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin. The high priest asks him a direct question. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus answers with a sentence that pulls several of these passages together. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verse 62, Jesus says, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." In one sentence, Jesus combines the imagery of Daniel 7 and Psalm 110, the Son of Man coming in with the clouds of heaven and the ruler seated at God's right hand. And the reaction is immediate. The high priest tears his clothes and said, "You have heard the blasphemy." Now, that reaction only makes sense if the council understood exactly what Jesus was claiming. He was not simply claiming to be a human king. He was placing himself directly inside the pattern we've been tracing throughout the Hebrew scriptures. The heavenly Son of Man, the ruler beside God, the one who shares in God's authority, which explains why the response was so strong. The pattern in the text. So let's take a step back for a moment and look at the pattern we've just seen. In Daniel, a figure who looks human comes with the clouds of heaven and receives authority over all nations in Psalms 110. David speaks of a ruler greater than himself who is invited to sit at God's right hand and share in his rule. In Isaiah, a promised child from David's line bears the title El Gibor, mighty God. And in Malachi, the prophet announces that the Lord himself will come to his temple. These passages were written centuries before the time of Jesus. And by the Second Temple period, Jewish readers were already wrestling with what they meant, which means the puzzle we've been examining didn't start with Christianity. It started with the scriptures themselves. Daniel's Son of Man on the clouds, David, the Lord at God's right hand, Isaiah, the child called mighty God, El Gibor. And when Jesus stood in front of the Sanhedrin and said, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven," he was stepping directly into that pattern, which explains why the reaction was so strong. The pieces were already there in the text. One final thought. At the beginning of this video, we read a line from an ancient Jewish text. "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his Kedoshim, his holy ones." By now, you've seen the pattern in the Hebrew scriptures, and you've seen why Jesus' claim caused the reaction that it did. But notice something else in that line. The Lord doesn't come alone. He comes with 10,000s of his Kedoshim, his holy ones. In the New Testament, that same word is used for the saints. That's you, if you're a Christian, which is quite a thought. God's new divine counsel. Food for thought. Thanks for watching.